When I look back on it, I can't pinpoint the exact moment the cracks began to form. Maybe it was too gradual to notice at first, like a hairline fracture spreading invisibly until the foundation gives way. For years, my wife, Lauren, and I lived a quiet, stable life. We were partners in every sense of the word. At least that's what I believed. Our routines were ordinary but comforting: weeknight dinners at the kitchen table, Saturday morning grocery runs, the occasional weekend getaway. Nothing flashy, nothing extraordinary, but it was ours. Lauren had always been a practical woman. She liked to plan ahead, organize, and keep things orderly. That's one of the things I loved about her. She made me feel like my life had structure, purpose. I'm not saying everything was perfect. We'd argue sometimes, usually about trivial things, like whose turn it was to take out the trash or why I couldn't remember to close the cabinet doors. But those arguments never lasted long. We'd always find our way back to each other. Then, things started to change, subtle at first. Lauren seemed distracted, distant. She'd sit on the couch scrolling through her phone for hours, barely acknowledging me when I spoke. When I asked if something was wrong, she'd shake her head and say she was just tired. Work was stressful, she said. She just needed some space. I believed her. Why wouldn't I? It wasn't until she casually mentioned Dave one evening that I felt the first twinge of unease. We were having dinner. Nothing fancy, just spaghetti and a bottle of cheap red wine. She'd been quiet most of the meal. And then out of nowhere, she said, "I got a message from Dave today." "Dave?" I asked, pausing with my fork halfway to my mouth. "My ex," she said, as if I should have known. "He's been going through some things. Just wanted to reconnect." I nodded, not sure what to say. I'd heard her mention Dave once or twice before, always in passing. He was part of her past, someone she dated briefly in her 20s before their relationship fizzled out. I'd never given him much thought. Why would I? He was ancient history, or so I thought. "That's nice of him to check in," I said finally, trying to keep my tone light. She shrugged and went back to eating, as if the conversation meant nothing. But that night, as I lay in bed next to her, staring up at the dark ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. A few weeks later, Dave showed up, not physically, at least not yet. It started with texts and phone calls, little interruptions that gradually became more frequent. Lauren would laugh at something on her phone, and when I asked what was so funny, she'd say, "Oh, it's just Dave. He's hilarious." I tried not to let it bother me. I told myself it was innocent, that Lauren was just being friendly. But the more I heard his name, the more it grated on me. It was like he was worming his way into our lives, little by little. And then one day, he was here, in our home. Lauren invited him over for dinner. She said it so casually, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Dave's in town," she said. I thought it would be nice to catch up. I wanted to protest, to tell her I wasn't comfortable with the idea. But the words caught in my throat. What kind of husband would that make me, if I couldn't trust her to have dinner with an old friend? So I said nothing. The night he came over, I made an effort to be polite. I shook his hand, offered him a beer, and tried to make small talk. Dave was charming, I'll give him that. He had a way of commanding attention, of drawing people in. Lauren laughed at his jokes, the kind of deep, belly laugh I hadn't heard from her in months. And every time she laughed, I felt like I was being pushed further and further out of the room. By the end of the night, I felt like a guest in my own home. Dave stayed late, long after I'd gone to bed. I could hear their voices drifting up from the living room, low and conspiratorial. When Lauren finally came upstairs, she slipped into bed without a word. Dave became a regular presence in our lives. He'd drop by unannounced, always with some excuse. He was in the neighborhood, he needed advice about something, or he just wanted to see how we were doing. Lauren welcomed him with open arms every time. She'd pour him a drink, ask him about his day, and hang on his every word. And me, I was just there, an afterthought. I tried to tell myself it didn't matter. I tried to believe that Dave's presence in our lives was harmless, that Lauren's kindness was just a reflection of the generous, compassionate person I'd fallen in love with. But as the days turned into weeks and then months, it became harder to ignore the nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach, the sense that I was being slowly, methodically erased. It wasn't just the way Lauren lit up when Dave was around, though that was hard enough to watch. It was the little things, the subtle ways she began to shift away from me, the way she stopped asking me about my day, stopped laughing at my jokes, The way she'd turn her back to me in bed at night. Her phone glowing softly as she texted God knows who. And then there were the moments I'd catch them together. The way she leaned in when Dave spoke. Her eyes locked on his like he was the most fascinating person in the world. The way she'd touch his arm lightly, casually, as if it were nothing. But it wasn't nothing. I knew it wasn't. I felt like I was losing her, piece by piece. And the worst part was, I didn't know how to stop it. Every time I tried to bring it up, Lauren would shut me down. You're being ridiculous, she'd say. Dave's going through a tough time. He needs friends right now. Don't be such a man baby. That word man baby hit me like a punch to the gut. It wasn't just the word itself, though it stung plenty. It was the way she said it, with a kind of exasperated disdain, like I was a child throwing a tantrum. I wanted to scream, to tell her how unfair she was being, how much it hurt to see her prioritize him over me. But instead, I swallowed my pride and said nothing, because maybe she was right. Maybe I was being ridiculous. But deep down, I knew I wasn't. I knew that what I was feeling wasn't jealousy or insecurity. It was something deeper, something darker. It was the realization that I was losing my wife, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. The nights grew longer, lonelier. I'd sit on the couch long after Lauren had gone to bed, staring blankly at the television, the sound turned down low. Sometimes I'd pour myself a drink, the whiskey burning my throat as I tried to drown out the ache in my chest. Other times, I'd go for long drives, the empty streets stretching out before me like a promise I couldn't keep. I began to withdraw, not just from Lauren but from everyone. I stopped answering calls from friends, stopped showing up to work functions. I didn't have the energy to pretend everything was okay, not when everything inside me was screaming that it wasn't. And all the while, Dave was there, filling the space I used to occupy. He'd sit in my chair at the dinner table, laugh with Lauren over private jokes I wasn't privy to, and make himself at home in a way I never could. It was like he was replacing me, piece by piece, until there was nothing left of me at all. I wanted to fight back, to tell Dave to leave, to demand that Lauren choose between us. But every time I tried to summon the courage, I faltered, because what if she didn't choose me? What if I'd already lost her, and I was just too blind to see it? So I did nothing. I sat back and watched as my life fell apart, helpless to stop it. And in those quiet, desperate moments, I began to wonder if I'd ever really had her at all. One night, after another argument, I packed a bag and left. I didn't have a plan. I just needed to get out, to breathe. The house felt like a tomb, filled with memories of a life that no longer existed. I checked into a cheap motel on the edge of town, the kind of place where the buzzing neon sign outside the window cast an eerie glow over everything. It wasn't much, but it was quiet. For the first time in what felt like forever, I was alone. The first night, I barely slept. My thoughts churned endlessly, a loop of self-recrimination and confusion. I thought about all the ways I'd failed, all the things I could have done differently. I replayed every argument, every moment of doubt, searching for some clue, some turning point where it had all gone wrong. But mostly, I thought about Lauren, the woman I'd fallen in love with, the woman who'd chosen someone else over me. The days blurred together. I wandered aimlessly, spending hours sitting in the motel's threadbare armchair, staring at the peeling wallpaper. I'd eat meals out of vending machines, too apathetic to venture beyond the motel's parking lot. Anger would come in waves, followed by crushing sadness. I'd lash out at myself, pounding my fists on the flimsy motel table, and then collapse into the chair, exhausted by the weight of it all. But then, slowly, something shifted. It wasn't a sudden revelation or a dramatic turning point. It was quieter than that, like the faintest crack of light seeping through a boarded-up window. On the fifth day, I went for a walk. It was cold, the crisp autumn air biting at my skin, but it felt invigorating. I walked aimlessly, letting my feet carry me through unfamiliar streets lined with golden, rustling leaves. For the first time in months, I felt alive. I realized, as I stood beneath a towering oak tree shedding its leaves, that I couldn't keep living like this. I couldn't keep letting Lauren and Dave dictate my happiness. Couldn't keep wallowing in what I'd lost. I deserved better. I deserved to find myself again, to rebuild, even if it meant starting from scratch. That night, back at the motel, I took out a notebook I'd packed on a whim and started writing. At first, it was just scattered thoughts, a jumble of emotions I couldn't untangle in my head. But as the words filled the pages, I began to see a path forward. It wasn't clear or easy, but it was there, and for the first time in a long time, I felt hope. I went back to the house to pack up the rest of my things. I'd spent days preparing myself for this moment, rehearsing in my mind what I'd say if Lauren tried to stop me. But when I arrived and stepped through the door, I was greeted not with anger or confrontation, but with an unsettling quiet. Lauren was there, sitting on the edge of the couch, her face pale and drawn. For the first time, I saw the cracks in her perfect facade. Her once bright eyes were rimmed with shadows, her shoulders hunched as if carrying a weight she could no longer bear. It struck me then how tired she looked, how much the woman sitting before me resembled a stranger. And Dave, he was nowhere to be found. She glanced up as I entered, her gaze briefly meeting mine before dropping to her hands. "He left," she said quietly, as if reading my thoughts. Her voice was thin, almost a whisper. He wasn't who I thought he was." There was no venom in her words, no defiance, just resignation. It felt like she'd been waiting for this moment, dreading it as much as I had. I stood there for a moment, letting her admission hang in the air between us. Part of me wanted to ask for details, to press her for an explanation, but another part of me didn't care. What was done was done. I nodded and headed upstairs to pack. My steps felt heavier with every creak of the wooden stairs, each one echoing through the silence. The house felt different now, hollow, almost unrecognizable. The photos on the walls, the knick-knacks on the shelves, all the little things that had once made this place feel like home now felt foreign, as if they belonged to someone else. As I pulled my suitcase from the closet, I heard her footsteps behind me. She lingered in the doorway, watching as I folded shirts and placed them neatly inside. "I'm sorry," she said finally, her voice trembling. "I didn't mean for things to end up like this." I paused, my hands resting on the edge of the suitcase. For a brief moment, I considered turning around, saying something, anything that might offer her comfort or closure. But I didn't. Instead, I zipped up the suitcase and straightened my back. "Take care of yourself, Lauren," I said, my voice steady but distant. Her breath hitched, and I thought I heard her stifle a sob. But I didn't turn around. I couldn't. I walked past her, down the stairs, and out the front door without looking back. As I stepped into the cool evening air, a strange sense of relief washed over me. The weight I'd been carrying for so long was still there, but it felt lighter somehow. I knew I wasn't free yet, not entirely, but this was a start. And for now, that was enough. It's been 6 months since I left. I've moved into a small apartment across town, started therapy, and reconnected with old friends. Life isn't perfect, but it's mine. I'm learning to find joy in the little things: a good cup of coffee, a long walk in the park, the quiet satisfaction of knowing I made it through the storm. As for Lauren, she's reached out a few times, but I've kept my distance. I'm not angry anymore. I've let that go, but I know I can't go back. Some things, once broken, can't be fixed, and that's okay, because for the first time in a long time, I feel free.